So, reflecting on the past 2 weeks of the course and answering the prompt for this week's reflection, I definitely do think that the study of the Holocaust is something that is very important today. And I might even say it's one of those events in history thus far that will always be relevant because I think it gives insight into, I guess, kind of what I would call the human condition and just kind of like the frailty of the human mind is kind of what I've taken away from these past 2 weeks about how what you would, I dare say, consider good German people and how they would be able to fall, um, you want to call it to such a fall to such an extent that they would actually consider what Hitler and the Nazis were doing as something acceptable. Um, and so I think in that sense it like I said it's something that we can learn from, and I think it's something important to study because based on the historical events that occurred before the Holocaust, what led up to it, how Hitler gained power, the atrocities that the Nazis committed during the war. I think all of that can teach us, and we should learn from that in order to as a society, just prevent anything of that sort from happening again. And I mean, just kind of reflecting on present day, I think in the West, maybe not as much, but definitely in other parts of the world, um, in parts that are struggling with dictatorships and things like that, I think it is not uncommon to see some of those ideologies still very present to this day, but that maybe are ignored, at least in Western society, because it doesn't really concern us. And so that's the other thing I kind of taken away from these past 2 weeks is how time distances one from historical events, even ones as atrocious as the Holocaust, and the murdering of so many people, and especially for the murdering of so many Jews. So I think the historical perspective that the Holocaust provides is something that should always be studied. In terms of the scenes or texts that have impacted me the most, um, last week's like first person account at Treblinka, that was absolutely in conjunction and with the scenes from Night and Fog. It was really hard to watch and read because of just the amount of detail that he described and the horrific ways, not only that the people at the camps were murdered, um, or how horrible they were worked to death and worked in the labor camps. I think that and then this week's reading of I can't really say his name very well, but Klemper, I believe it is. His account was very different from someone who actually didn't live through the atrocities in the camps, but how still even someone who considered themselves a German through and through, how they still suffered and were stripped of their civil liberties and their freedom and even their basic human rights. Um, his account was also eye-opening. It's one that I don't think I'd ever read before from the majority of the accounts I had heard or read of regarding the Holocaust is typically from survivors of the labor camps or the death camps. To read one from someone outside of that was very intriguing. And then watching the movie Shoah, or the documentary, excuse me, I think the scenes that hit me the most were just the I kind of want to say like casual nature sometimes of especially some of the interviewees, and how they had distanced themselves from those events, even though when the movie was filmed that had only been like maybe 30 years removed from when those interviews took place. Some of the interviews kind of seemed like the interviewees where they were like just that happened way long ago and were kind of distant. So like I said earlier, it struck me with the time, kind of like that time dimension of all of this about how time distances humanity from the events that have taken place in the past, and how that's why the study of events like this is so important, and that we have to recognize them for what they are, because I think not doing so, not studying them, and kind of trying to forget is kind of the same as admitting it didn't happen, which I think is a very, very dangerous path to walk, because we would not learn from these events, and most likely, if anything, history has shown is that history repeats itself. So without the study of these events, I think, I mean, something like this would be very prone to happen again, given, like I said at the very beginning, the frailty of the human mind and the fallen nature of kind of humanity, if you want to put it that way. So yeah, that is kind of my reflection for this week over the past 2 weeks of readings and movies that we have watched in the course.